It is a working class politics in the sense, or what would be called in classical Marxist terms, a radical bourgeois politics, which will advance the interests of the working class, and which is eminently
No,
desirable and
that's
necessary.
I think that's fine. I might seek to hold you to account for some past statements or past lines of criticism that you've mounted, but this is not a show trial, so I will not be doing this. No.
It's not a
That's for
trial
another time.
It's not a trial show.
Take the
It's a
opportunity.
trial.
It's a trial show. It's not a show trial. Yeah, that's good line.
Take the
George.
opportunity.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga, Lima ou
Hello. Welcome back, loyal BungaCast listeners, and indeed, new listeners who may be with us for the first time. How's everyone doing? I'm Alex O'Keefe in São Paulo, Brazil, joined by George Hoare somewhere in the wilds of Oxfordshire. Hello, George.
Yeah, I'm near the Cotswolds. I'm here to protest against JD Vance's visit to our country.
Good. Are you holding up the meme of the baby face JD Vance? Apparently,
No, I'm not. I'm holding up a sign that says "Down with this sort of thing." No, that's
Excellent.
obviously not what I'm doing. I'm on holiday, but I'm taking time out of my holiday to speak to you guys. What a that just makes a holiday better.
Very good. Absolutely.
Sure does.
Holiday without podcasting. So that voice you hear there is Philip Cunliffe, formerly a permanent member of the Security Council of this podcast. Now I don't know what you call it. One of the
El Presidente for life.
Well, I'm not sure. We'll see about that. We are here to discuss Phil's book. So Phil is very much a guest of the podcast today. That's the role that he occupies. If you don't know Phil, he's Associate Professor of International Relations at UCL, and we're discussing Phil's latest book, The National Interest, Politics After Globalization, which is now out from Polity.
Yeah, and if you haven't bought a copy already, listener, what have you been doing? Just go on to Amazon or other bookshop and do buy a copy. But just to frame
out since July in the UK, available in the US from September.
And I guess actually you might as well listen to the end of the episode and decide if you want to purchase a copy. But hopefully you will do, because I think there's a lot of really important and interesting stuff that we can discuss. So to frame the discussion a little bit, so with peak globalization behind us, we urgently need a new debate about the national interest. Yet across the West, it is a concept that is conspicuous by its absence from public life. All too often, the national interest is seen as a parochial idea, an anachronism in an age of global environmental collapse and polycrisis. So just to continue this, and this is, I think, a good summary, and I believe this is from the promotional material of the books. I'm obviously ventriloquizing Phil here, but political leaders accustomed to making their case to the world at large rather than to their fellow citizens treat the national interest as an embarrassment. Yet we will not be able to rise to the challenges that confront us without the legitimacy conferred by the national interest. This book explains how globalizing political leaders and bureaucrats smothered the idea of the national interest over the past 30 years, and how we must now revive it if we are to have the democratic strength to meet the international challenges of the future. Instead of seeing the national interest as a matter of foreign policy, this book makes the case that the national interest is as much a matter of internal democratic politics as it is global order. So that's just to kind of, I guess, situate some of the discussion that we're going to be having, some of the political stakes as well. But Phil, and this is obviously strange to interview on this podcast, but thank you for taking the time.
You're very welcome.
Blah, blah, blah. How did you first become interested in the idea of the national interest?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and there's a short answer and a long answer, and I'll try and give both briefly. So the longer answer is it's been connected, I suppose, to my thinking about empire and military intervention in the era of globalization for a while. And as a student in particular, when I was first tackling some of these questions, and just for those listeners who don't know, my PhD was looking at developing countries' involvement in UN peacekeeping. And that was something very counterintuitive because, my instinct was to say that military involvement, say, humanitarian intervention and so on, was archetypal imperialism, kind of justified on the grounds of humanitarian altruism, very similar to the kinds of justifications that might have been given for the kind of militant spread of Christianity, even in the 19th century, or the elimination of the slave trade that allowed the British to spread colonial rule throughout Africa. Whereas the involvement of poor countries in peacekeeping seemed a bit less obvious, right? And so it was trying to understand what was the motivation behind their involvement in being kind of these large multinational military expeditions, so seemingly remote from any concept of their own national interest. And here I'm thinking of, like Bangladeshis would be deployed to West Africa, for instance, very far from Bangladesh's own borders. And there's no, you can hardly accuse the Bangladeshis of imperialism in West Africa. And also the instinct was, well, there must be some purpose, right, to the humanitarian imperialism of the West in this period. There must be some ulterior motive. There must be some strategy. There must be some kind of connection to oil pipelines or adjacent oil pipelines or critical resources or rubber in West Africa or uranium deposit. There's always this kind of scrabbling around for finding something behind it. You want to kind of believe that there is some purpose behind the seeming random contingencies. So I suppose I came to these questions originally with a kind of vulgar Leninism in mind. Behind my instinctive suspicion and hostility. So I've been chewing over these questions for a while in terms of trying to understand state behavior in the international sphere. The short answer is that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it coincided with LGBTQIA History Month in the UK, which has been observed since 2005 in February. And I noticed, to my surprise, that the trans pride flag, which had been flying over the campus at the University of Kent, where I still was at that point, it was taken down and replaced by the Ukrainian flag. And I was very struck by that because it was the first time ever on a university campus that I'd seen a national flag. And I thought, what are the circumstances in which you can replace something so sacred to the identity of the university, such as the trans pride flag, with a national flag? And so what are the circumstances in which it is legitimate to express national pride? And this obviously was the start. We've spoken about this on the podcast before, but this was the start of a wave of national fervor on behalf of another country. So it was interesting to me to think about how ideas of nationhood, you could tarry or play with this idea of nationhood, but only at a safe distance. Just to say it was legitimate to be patriotic on behalf of Ukraine, but the idea, for instance, that you could replace the trans pride flag with a union flag was obviously inconceivable, and they ran it up for one day when the Queen died, but quickly ran it down again, So it was this that prompted the thought that seeing how the Western elites were toying with the idea of reviving the nation at a safe distance to them. I mean, not at a safe distance, obviously, to Ukraine and Ukrainians, reviving ideas of nationhood in the context of Eastern Europe's bloodlands, that is not a straightforward or easy prospect. But for the West, it was okay to be patriotic on behalf of another country.
Yeah, no, it was a striking period. I guess your short answer was probably about as long as your long answer, if you want some feedback on those. However, I think it's both are interesting. Vulgar Leninism and flags. I mean, two different ways to approach these kind of problems of international relations. But I think I think one of the reasons why the book is so good because it really nails that this concept is conspicuous by its absence in the analysis of the way that states behave, and also some aspects of the internal culture of those states. But maybe just to kind of talk listeners through this a little bit, could you tell us about how the national interest disappeared from our political vocabulary? Because one of the things the book posits is that this essentially used to be part of the way we might talk about politics, not quite so much anymore. And what came to replace it? Because I think there's some interesting stuff here.
Yeah, so I think you would struggle to find examples of the national interest being explicitly talked about in public life, and in a way that is strange compared to the last 200 years of public political discussion. So, in particular, the national interest disappears in Europe because, obviously, as part of the process of European integration, it's seen as something which is anathema. So the idea is pooling sovereignty and bringing states together, and therefore it becomes redundant and embarrassing to speak about the national interest because everybody's interests are collective. In the US, in the period of the last 30 to 40 years, the national interest, there's a magazine called The National Interest, but really the US becomes essentially, under conditions of unipolar globalization, the single superpower. Its discussions become directly the discussions of global interest. So the US doesn't speak in terms of national interest or in any kind, or when they do, it's not distinguished in any kind of meaningful way from the interest of the world at large. It's what humanity needs to do, what the world needs to do, what the world trading system needs to do, what we need to do to tackle climate change, what we need to do to defend democracy, what we need to do to defend human rights, what we need to do to fight terrorism, whatever it might be. And so in that period, the national interest, in the sense of that there are distinctive interests that belong to separate states, gets blended away through that process of global politics, where essentially everybody, because of globalization and the idea that this rising tide of prosperity lifts all ships, nobody needs to articulate a separate interest because everybody's interests are essentially the same. More global trade, more global growth, and greater international integration and collaboration. So the notion of any kind of distinctive political articulation of a separate interest becomes redundant. Now, that's the last 40 years. It has deeper roots. You can trace it through to the period of the Cold War. And this here I take from Perry Anderson's account of how it is precisely in the period when the democratic franchise, reaches its culmination in the post-war period, that nation states in the West begin to retreat from the language of nationhood, precisely to avoid the kind of political pressure and accountability that comes with it. And the idea of the nation becomes substituted with talk of the free world or the West. And so we have all these euphemistic ways to talk about this collectivity of states that form the Atlantic Western Alliance, Western civilization, the West, and so on. And all of those are ways, that's the free world of the Cold War becomes the international community of the global era. And it's that world that is now ending with peak globalization behind us, as you said. So there are different ways in which the national interest has been suppressed over the last 50 to 70 years.
Yeah, no. So I guess just to kind of put you on the spot a little bit, what do you think is the number one thing that has replaced the national interest? Is it kind of human rights? Is it the global interest? What one phrase or kind of idea is now where the national interest used to lie in these kind of discussions?
I think it was globalization. So if there was a single idea and concept which replaced it was globalization, because it packaged together notions of global environmental stewardship and responsibility, the idea of a planetary crisis that overwhelmed the possible responses of any national political system, and also came with human rights, the idea that human rights were something that were transcendent. They were something which had to be kind of ramified downwards and embedded within nation states rather than something that were expressed through them. So I think it'd be globalization would be the thing that was the single idea that replaced notions of the national interest.
So I think the book presents a very convincing account, particularly the historical sections of it, of how the national interest disappeared. And I have loads of questions which I'd like to clarify as to how what exactly consists of the national interest? Is it just a little rhetorical trick or instrument, or is it something more substantial? I think we're going to come on to all these questions, but I want to ask here, take the opportunity, because you say that I find the book very convincing in its account both of European post-nationalism and how it applies to the US, where it seems more obvious, as you've been saying. It seems almost self-evident that the US pursues national interests, but as an empire and at a period of kind of unquestioned supremacy of the whole globe, which is unparalleled in human history, really, that actually the US interest actually is more like the global interest as part of the empire and the sustaining of that empire. And it's very hard to distinguish the two. I think that's all very convincing. Where I'm less sure is when you claim something like only rarely, if ever, is a policy justified on the grounds that it is in the national interest or good for the nation. This, I think, from the introduction. And I wonder how true that is more widely, because is this book, and this is a question which I put actually to Wolfgang Strick about his book, which I think is similarly strong, but perhaps has an element of presentation of being about the world, but might actually be more strong if it's limited to Europe, geographically speaking. So I want to know, is this book about Europe, or is it about the globe? Because I can, just to kind of spell this out a little bit, I can go through and I can pick kind of random countries and go, well, okay, is that true there? Is that true there? Right? So I don't know. It can go like, okay, Turkey. Well, I don't know. I think Turkey is pretty nationalist. It defends stuff in the national interest. It can be pretty aggressive and so on. Brazil, well, Brazil's not aggressive, but it maintains alliances with different countries, or not even alliances, relations with many different countries. It's a continental country which is very much turned on itself and against its Spanish-speaking neighbors, and so you don't really have a sense of serving globalism from Brazilian political rhetoric. It's kind of focusing on itself. Argentina, well, okay, you could say Argentina. The Argentinian national interest would be to default on its debts, right? But that becomes which is a question actually we discussed in an episode maybe a year or two ago called "Why Not Default?" Right? So maybe Argentina could do with following its national interest, but of course that becomes a class question within Argentina between those who want to serve the creditors and those who would prefer to default. Jamaica, to take a small country. Well, okay, then Jamaica could serve its national interest maybe a bit better, but it's a weak country, isolated, it doesn't have that much room for maneuver. So what does the national interest mean there? Thailand, okay, Thailand is pretty subservient to the US, so maybe it could do with being less subservient to the US. India, China, well, those countries serve their national interest. Their politics is about the national interest. They're very nationalist. They can be pretty defensive of what they conceive of their national interest being in the international arena. So again, I find a very strong case for Europe, but I don't know if it applies elsewhere. And I wondered, what you have in mind? Who are you addressing this to?
Yeah, so I say at the start, the idea is most rigorously applied and tested to the democratic world. So, which is to say, Europe, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, one or two others, and Brazil and India would obviously fall within that too. I think in what you're suggesting, though, you're conflating, and so I'd stand by the claim that there is very little evidence that the national interest is a coherent structure or organizing framework for politics in these countries, for political government in these countries. And I think you're conflating a few things in the way in which you offered some counter examples. So talking about there might be plenty of national pride in various countries compared to post-national, kind of degenerate liberals in post-national Europe. There might be plenty of chauvinism and cultural chauvinism in various countries by comparison to post-national Europe. But I'm not sure they're organized on the basis of the national interest, or that they defend their foreign policies on the basis of national interest. And if you think about Turkey, I mean, the grand story of Turkey, for instance, in recent times is neo-Ottomanism, right? As the AKP has substituted the old Kemalist elite, that old Republican nationalist vision has been gradually eroded by this new concept of Turkey's place as a regional hegemon in the Middle East, invoking an older Islamic cosmopolitan imperial notion of how Turkey relates to the wider world. And obviously that's not substituted modern Turkish nationalism entirely, but it certainly speaks to the era of globalization, that has been the defining identity of Turkey, political identity of Turkey over the last in the period of globalization. And with India, for instance, it seems, the charge against India is cast in terms of the Hindu chauvinism of the BJP. So the substitution of Hindu chauvinism by the old secular nationhood that was projected, however problematically, by Congress. And there again, you have the substitution of it's a kind of expansive cultural idea with all of its kind of populist inflections, but it's reorganized the sense of nationhood in those countries. And so I think in that sense, you can also talk about a retreat from national interest and the way in which they understand what they're doing. If you think about the BJP, they will defend what they're doing in terms of asserting the claims of the Hindu majority, which have been unfairly repressed by the favoritism and special um, treatment shown to India's Muslims. And that seems to be a retreat from a secular idea of nationhood. And with Brazil, I mean, we've had this discussion before, Alex, but I think you consistently underestimate how far Brazil has been part of globalist politics. Notwithstanding what you say about its its kind of continental expanse and its inward focus, Brazil was absolutely integral to the NGO period of politics. You just think of Porto Alegre and everything that happened under Lula's cultivation of the anti-globalization movement that was associated with Brazil in various ways, and the fact that the MST, the landless peasants movement, the struggles of the Amazon were taken as some of the most iconic globalist struggles of the radical left of this period. And even go as far as to say some of that is also the case with the era of Bolsonaro's populist right-wing politics as well, in the sense that it's connected, very self-consciously connected, to a kind of Trumpy revanchism, rather than expressing an earlier concept of Brazilian nationhood and national interest. So, I don't want to overstate it, but I think certainly, and like I say, the thrust of the book is aimed at the democratic world, but I think you can see very similar patterns at play in the non-democratic world, and certainly outside of Europe and America.
Okay, so I mean, that being so, I want to understand a little bit better what the national interest then actually means, because obviously I prefer the secular nationalism of the Kemalists or the Congress Party to what the AKP's neo-Ottoman expansionism, or to the kind of ethnic communitarianism of the BJP. And I would prefer that Brazil followed its national interest a little bit more doggedly than it does. So, I'm sympathetic to what you say, but then are you not just proposing or preferring certain sorts of policies or certain programs to others? Why the national interest? Couldn't all of this fall into the national interest? And I think a lot of people who would encounter the phrase would think, well, Turkey's neo-Ottomanism serves the national interest of Turkey because it's pursuing its national interest at the expense of others. And so there's this disambiguation, which I think we have to do in terms of the domestic versus the foreign, and also in terms of what the national interest actually is. So when I'm thinking through this, I'm like, okay, is this an abstraction which can be fought over, which is that any political force could theoretically, even though they don't do that very much nowadays because they talk more in kind of globalist terms, but that any political force within any given country, talk up the national interest as a way of justifying its own interest, its own sectional interest, whether it's capitalist seeking profit, whether it's imperialist seeking adventure and conquest abroad, whether it's workers fighting for a greater share of the pie. Anything could be justified in the national interest. So is it just an abstraction? Or, and this is something that I think you kind of spell out a bit in the book, but I want to hear a little bit more. Is it something more akin to the general will, which then is a more domestic conception, which is really about like the national interest is the kind of summation of the will of all, except that in Rousseau's terms, of course, he distinguishes the general will, which is something at a higher order than just the will of all. Is that more what you're talking about? And so I think this also has implications for what level we understand the national interest operating at. Is it about international affairs, about one country pursuing its interest at the expense of others, or at the expense of alliances or supranational organizations? Or is it about a domestic thing, about effectively representation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So it's, I mean, I would, so a threefold answer. The first part is to say, that we might be nostalgic for, or one might be nostalgic for, say, the secular nationalism of Congress as opposed to the BJP, or for the old secular elite in Turkey compared to the Islamified elite of the AKP. Those were also failed, those were decayed projects, which is why they necessarily gave way to the new kind of political forms that we see now. So the failure of the Kemalist Republican elite is what allowed the AKP to consolidate its power. And similarly, the many derelictions of Congress is what has given the space for the BJP to emerge and substitute for Congress with this more chauvinistic and Hindu infused vision of what India means. So it's important to state that by way of opening. It's more, the question is that it's how the fact that these political projects are not justified with reference to, or justified less with reference to, a national project and the nation as a people. So they'll be justified by reference to other claims. So in post-national Europe, it'll be justified by the needs of European integration, collaboration with international partners. In other contexts, it might be justified by the need to serve global trade. In America, it'll simply be what we must do, meaning, there's no, in the kind of glory days of globalization, we in the America, the US, they'd say we, and meaning that this is what all of humanity must do, with no real effort to distinguish between the policy of the American state and what the demands or needs of humanity were. So it's what is it justified with reference to? Because that means that is the political claim as to whom you are accountable and potentially responsible. And flowing from that, like I indicated at the start, I think there is a temptation, particularly on the left, to assume this default kind of vulgar Leninist posture where you imagine behind every policy there is some material schema, some elaborate material schema to get hold of resources or market share or market access or some kind of ulterior strategy. And it's very easy to, imagine and scale this all up and to see sinister machinations behind any foreign policy move, and to assume, that the neo-Ottomanism, for instance, is just another version of the Turkish national interest. I think
So
that,
sorry, just would that be Lenin or vulgar Leninism washing to say that here is some ideological policy that you are trying to in fact explain through some kind of rational materialist framework? I
I
mean,
don't know about washing, but I mean, it's that washing would suggest when you're trying to launder something. So, but you can never really launder in with Leninism, because the point is you're suggesting if you're trying to legitimate it by, splashing it with pink or green or whatever way in which you're trying to legitimate something. The only parallel would be, it's the left trying to avoid thinking. So if when the left kind of takes a vulgar Leninist approach, I think it's a way to avoid trying thinking through the issue. So, but I mean, I'm saying vulgar Leninist by direct analogy with vulgar Marxist. But in this case, it's kind of scaled up onto a world stage where everything is about territory and resource grabs and enormous kind of global stratagems of power and what have you. And I think that default posture underestimates the extent to which the world has changed, the significance of a different distribution of power in the world, the difference between having many competing centers of state power or geopolitical rivalry in a single center of state power, and it also underestimates the extent to which global capitalism and states within it have reorganized themselves. So it is it is important if we are to be if we're to gain any kind of political traction or intellectual grip on the world before us. I think that we do not simply collapse everything into the national interest understood as some malevolent schema hatched by, a sinister kind of cabal, capitalist cabal pulling the strings of different states. So the shift away, if we use the example of Turkey and India, those shifts away from how they understood their political idea of nationhood, that's important. And then the third point is, yes, Alex, the way I develop the national interest is one of those concepts that is a quintessential modern concept. It emerges out of the earlier kind of proto prototype of the idea of reason of state, and it emerges in this dialectic with the emergence of nationhood. So as reason of state interacts with developing ideas of political collectivity and modernization, and with the emergence of the notion of a self-governing political community comprised of legally equal citizens, that classical idea of nationhood interacts with the idea of reason of state to cultivate and to establish this new idea of national interest. And it is very close to the concept of general will, in the sense of thinking about what is the higher order value of a given political community, of a given political system and polity. So to that extent, it is very much it is an idea of what is the overarching aim and interest of a given political collective.
So, I mean, then just to clarify, this reference to the people, to the whole people, or to the, perhaps not the whole people, maybe that presumes too much, but a reference to all the people of a nation, all citizens, is something which would both be a means of justifying any policy domestically as well as foreign policy, right?
Yes.
That would be the national interest. So that's the way that it would transverse the domestic foreign divide.
Yes, very explicitly. So I think it's particularly, and I suppose we'll get into this in due course, but the particular moment that we're at in terms of emerging from the breakdown or the end of globalization, that the concept of national interest can function as a idea which encompasses both domestic policy and also foreign policy, and perhaps treats them on the same register. And so the case I make in the book is that the national interest is something that becomes petrified in the era of the Cold War. It's essentially confiscated by the idea of national security, and it becomes solidified and frozen in all of these various transnational structures, such as NATO, the EEC on the one hand, and the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern Bloc. So it becomes something which is captured by the deep state effectively, and shut up in ideas of kind of national security planning, military-industrial complex, defense policy planning, and so on. And with the end of globalization, we have the opportunity to take the national interest, to recreate it in a way that's different from understanding it purely in terms of national security and foreign policy, something which is the exclusive monopoly of bureaucrats and specialists.
Following on from that last point in particular, why is this important? So what is it that we lose from politics if we don't have an idea of the national interest? And what, actually maybe we'll get onto some more concrete specific examples of what we might gain, but yeah, why is this important?
Yeah. So the basic answer to the question is it's important because it's a foundation of political representation. If we don't have a national interest, we don't have political representation. And if we don't have political representation, then we have no meaningful way to defend ourselves or our interests, particularly with regards to state power. So it is a quintessentially representative concept. The idea of national interest is that there is a collective demand, aspiration, vision that needs to be defended somehow on our behalf by the state and also by ourselves. And so, of necessity, it requires understanding what is shared by a given society, a given nation, a given people. So, if you don't have a national interest, you don't have political representation. It's as simple as that. If you do want a political representation, then you need to think in terms of national interest.
No, I have to say, I think that comes through very clearly in the book, and is, I should probably put my cards on the table and say that is something that appeals to me, that particular argument. So maybe to get a bit more concrete here, because I think we've talked a little bit about some of the kind of the ideas, the abstractions here, but what sorts of external, i.e. relating to international relations, and maybe internal, relating to domestic policy, discussions would be improved by looking at them through the lens of the national interest? Like, sell us this. Okay, you've convinced me. Perhaps this idea of representation is crucial, but what's the payoff if we were to introduce the national interest to political discussions more? How could it change, or how could it free us from some of the impasses that we're we're currently at politically. Yeah. What's
So
the what's the kind of the payoff for us if we were
I
to
challenge you,
become
George.
Cunliffeites?
I challenge you, George, to tell me what would not be improved by the national interest. Because I genuinely struggled when I was, when I was writing the book, when I was writing the manuscript, I genuinely struggled to think of a single area of policy debate, at least that I could think of, any major kind of policy debate in the Western world that I was familiar with. I couldn't think of a single one that wouldn't be improved by thinking in terms of the national interest. Now,
Well,
I'm sure.
let's okay. Housing. What about housing? This is something which is a big deal in the UK at the moment. How would that be improved by talking about it in terms of the national interest?
It's a serious issue. Like lots of people, it's a direct byproduct of asset price inflation, driven by kind of property, the global phenomenon of property bubbles and major urban hubs. It's connected to the free movement of capital and the free movement of people. And it's very much in the national interest that we have our citizens have the stability, the security that comes with having affordable and high quality housing. That seems to me straightforwardly because it's the nation. It's in the interest of the nation that its people enjoy the basis of secure livelihoods, and housing has to be a very important part of that. And particularly given the global phenomenon of the housing bubble, that seems to me very much eminently a national interest issue.
I mean, to play devil's advocate here, wouldn't landlords have their interest in charging rent? They make up the nation. Don't their interests also need to be served in this?
When somebody think of the landlords?
Yeah, I know. I'm not making myself popular here through this devil's advocate position, but anyway,
the devil's advocates can advocate for landlords. No, I actually just to build on Alex's question here. So the national interest is it always against another interest? The interest, so to counterpose the national interest to the landlord's interest, to the particular interest. How does this kind of work?
No, I think the national interest is the higher order interest in which you synthesize the antagonism of interest. So if you have the example of housing, you have obviously landlords have to take a hit, right? And that seems to me to be the national interest is a very effective battering ram for making that case. Right. I'm not saying that landlords, it seems very clear to me, like if you have a problem with housing, as you do in Britain and in many other developed, many other wealthy countries, as well as many other poor countries, right? They have to take a hit. And the reason they have to take a hit is because of the national interest. People need houses, right?
No, I'm just wondering if that's how interests work, though. Sorry, landlords, but your interests have been synthesized into a higher order interest. I mean, I think that
is politics, right?
Yeah,
and I think say. I mean, if you just say it, so you say like it's renters versus landlords, right? Or you can say it's in the national interest actually that we convert our renters into homeowners. I mean, that's the argument that's made in Britain, and you can argue whether or not that's a good idea. But putting that to one side for the moment, if you want to make that case, then you just kind of battering around, renters versus landlords. You can say it's in our collective interest, which is to say it's also in the landlord's interests as members of the nation that even though they have to take this economic hit by being deprived of their rental income, they nonetheless have to take this hit on behalf of the nation. And so that seems to me that is a synthesis of a higher order interest. You appeal to their interest as citizens, and you rally the other side on the basis that it's not just in your selfish economic interest or in the collective interest of this group that all shares a common economic interest, but it's also in all of our interests, in fact.
So the synthesis of interest there, I mean, perhaps Marxists, those interested in class struggle, will be going, what does this mean? We're going to come back to that towards the end of this. But for now, I wanted to ask perhaps a little bit more of a more formal question. But the rise and fall of the nation, your historical account in the book, is treated as an intellectual and a political phenomenon, right? So intellectually, in terms of the devaluing of the nation, the turn towards globalism, whether it's through neoliberalism or other moments of the turn away from the nation, and politically, of course, with the kind of course through the turn towards increasing kind of global alliances, American unipolarity, etc., etc. Now, and indeed a focus on trade as the only way towards development, which I think is important, an important aspect as well, particularly in light of today's politics, where trade has again come into focus and very much an element of political contestation. But I think you could equally trace the fortunes of the nation in a more political economic sense. Follow the process of capitalist development and indeed de-development, where the nation emerges and falls as a consequence of the rise and fall of classes. The rising bourgeoisie holds up the nation, and then over time comes to actually abandon it as it seeks its fortunes out in the big world beyond the nation. Or as a facet of different accumulation regimes, right, where the nation is important in the early and mid 20th century as a process of development and capital accumulation, and then when capital demands something else because of the crisis and profitability in the mid 70s, that profit needs to go find new avenues, right? Capital needs to find new avenues for profitability, and so you need globalization. So, for example, on page 28, you talk about outsourcing to China, excuse me, as a moment of a turn away from the nation. But that seems to me, just following neoliberal ideology and indeed the demands of capital in the face of falling profitability. So is there not a kind of political economic story that you're missing out here?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I've tried to. I mean, I don't tell the story in terms of. It could, you could tell the story as you suggest, purely in terms of shifting paradigms of economic and development thinking, and I think you would end up with a parallel story that looked very similar. I try to weave between those stories, and one of the core hinges of the argument in the book, not core hinges, one of the hinges of the argument in the book, is that it is precisely the attempt to evade the public pressure, the accountability that is possible through the nation, and the enfranchisement that comes, the political egalitarianism and enfranchisement that comes with the nation, which is to say, particularly the extension of the vote to the working class, that you get the attempt to evade the nation, right? And that is the flight into globalism and into neoliberalism. And so it is very much interwoven with that story. So I also took a lot of inspiration from David Edgerton's book, who we've had on to talk about his work in the past, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, a story which tells that history of Britain as a nation state, emerging roughly in the interwar period up until the 1970s on the basis of a very national vision of development, nationalized industries, strong unions, and politics, which is very firmly focused on the British nation state, and how the effort to evade and dismantle that leads to the emergence of globalization. So everything you said, Alex, I think is very much, it's simply restating the argument that I make in the book. I see globalization as an attempt to evade the nation. This is a process which obviously takes decades, but the failure to develop the nation further, the failure to meet the demands that were increasingly heaped up on the governing elites of the 1970s in the face of their inability to continue to maintain full employment at consistent rates of growth and to meet the wage demands that were being pressed by organized labor. They try to escape that by dismantling those pressure points at which they were subject to democratic force from the demands imposed by the nation. So the story of globalization, I think, can be seen as a flight from the nation, an attempt to evade the problems that were thrown up by the nation state itself, which was in turn a solution to problems of an earlier era.
So, just to be clear, because I agree that you can tell the story in different ways, right? With a more political economic angle, more political or intellectual angle, etc., and the story comes out the same. I agree. I guess there's an element of a question about causality, right? Whether this is caused by elites wanting to escape the nation or by the simple demands of profitability or capital accumulation.
But I don't think it's separate. I'm not sure, it's, I don't think it's a separate thing.
Yeah, no, I guess because there's a politics that ensues from the different causal kind of weights that you put on it. And one might be, well, you know, these perfidious elites who should instead be tending to the nation, they're trying to run away. Bad on them, right? Which leads to kind of moralistic and kind of idealistic politics versus one which understands the fact that we live in a capitalist society and that profitability is the kind of where the buck stops ultimately.
But it's only to say that they were unwilling to absorb the cost of what was necessary. So, in as much as they were unwilling to take, whatever hit might have been necessary to sustain the nation, you can put that in terms of declining profitability, but it is still amounts to the same thing. It seems to me you had a capitalist ruling class that was unable to sustain its rule on the grounds of nationhood, and so they retreated from that model. And I'm not sure it's not to suggest that the retreat was they evaded its consequences. It's not to suggest that retreat was intellectual, and as I discuss in the book, it's something which is, there's different moments of it. There's set piece battles between organized labor and capital, in the case of Britain in particular, with the miners' strike, but also with the Volcker shock in the US. But then you also have different kinds of accommodation with the Mitterrand socialist government, where it folds into Europe in a way to avoid the demands that were being pressed by the French working class. So it's a tortured and contested process. It's not simply, exiting from one door and entering through another. But nonetheless, it seems to me it can still be told as a story of trying to evade and escape the consequences of democratic accountability, understood in a political economic sense, not just in terms of voting, but in terms of the expectations as to what the state could do in economic life as well.
So I guess one of the questions which comes out of the discussion so far is what it means to assert the national interest today. I guess kind of what I mean by this is what happens if, you're a victim of your own success. One or two or maybe all of Keir Starmer's spads go out and buy the book and read it, and, just suddenly, maybe in Britain, maybe elsewhere, it just happens that a state starts asserting its national interest, starts adopting this language of the national interest, left, right, and centre. Or what happens if elites more generally start picking up this language and using it? Would it be meaningful necessarily, or are there kind of other conditions, other political mechanisms for representation that would need to be there in order for it to be kind of the quote unquote true national interest, rather than just a rhetorical, kind of watered down version of it?
No, I think it would be benefit to so in the case of Britain or in any other country where I don't think I could be a victim of my own success, in the sense that the more that the national interest is discussed in political life or public life, the better it seems to me that it would be for every citizen of every nation, and through that for everyone in the world, in that everyone will be thinking in terms of what it is that they want in the political context in which they have the most influence, which is to say, as citizens of a given state. What can they want? What can the state do for them? And what can they get out of that, of their individual relationship to the state and the wider political community of which they're a part? So I can't see any scenario. I mean, of his famous last words, but I can't see any scenario in which that would be damaging to the thesis of the book. So if Keir Starmer's spads read it and they started deploying the language of the national interest, so much the better. And this is, the great example here is Trump, of course, because Trump does talk in terms of the national interest. And it's also precisely on the grounds on which he can be held to account, because the notion that he embodies the national interest directly as a person, as an individual, is very obviously inadequate as sufficient to really meaningfully represent or embody the nation. So if you think about the way in which he has to be front and center in terms of cutting trade deals, everything has to be kind of organized personally through him on the basis of his personal authority. That's very much substituting for the nation. rather than putting forward the interests of the American nation. Everything needs to be Trump branded, right? Otherwise, it doesn't feel politically meaningful for him. And that reflects political weakness, right? His suspicion and distance from the machinery of the state, his unwillingness to kind of wrangle Congress, despite the fact he has the majority there, and his domination over the Republican Party, and his, no doubt his own vanity and the own style of his political leadership. So the national interest is a way to hold him to account. So even in the context in which the national interest might become taken up by charismatic leaders like Trump or uncharismatic leaders like Keir Starmer, there is nonetheless the potential, I think, to deepen and expand the notion of a institutionalized representative political relationship between citizen and state, and the national interest can solidify and strengthen that.
Yeah, so I mean, I follow you that far, and I, in general, would understand a field of political competition in which fighting over the national interest would be better than what we have now. I think that could be, good for advancing a politics which is much more rooted in interests and rooted kind of in domestic needs, and perhaps be more universalistic, in fact, than what currently obtains, which kind of runs counter to, I think, probably how a lot of people would understand this, to understand the national interest as particularist against some other sort of universalism. The national interest might be more universalizing than what we currently have. My question is a little bit different, but it kind of follows on from this notion of, what happens if your idea gets taken up. And that's that all interventions can have unintended consequences. So although in the book you're clear that the nationalism you have in mind is, or the national interest you have in mind is one which is secular, inclusive, democratic, revolutionary, perhaps indeed. But, it might be that it gets taken up by political entrepreneurs who run within a different way. And I wonder what you'd say to that. So, for example, I could see the risk that someone takes up this idea of national interest and goes, well, it ends up fortifying egoism, chauvinism, exclusion. So I'm just going to cite some passages from the book, right, as a way of giving a little bit of meat to this. So from page 109, you treat ethnic nationalism as something that's of the periphery, right? So I'm quoting here, nationalism decayed into ethnic nationalism, and then you cite Serbian, Iraqi Sunni, Tutsi, Kosovar, Chechen. It makes me think, well, what about English nationalism, U.S. Christian nationalism, Polish nationalism, whatever? These are all also things that exist in our world. It's not merely something that's over there in the periphery. On page 113, you note that sovereignty is often understood in cultural rather than political terms, a defensive reaction rather than a political articulation of representative public power. Okay, that latter stuff, good. That's what we should understand sovereignty as. But a lot of people don't. And it's not just a matter of misunderstanding. There's plenty of nationalists about, including in Western Europe and North America, who treat nation and sovereignty as precisely cultural matters, even racial matters, right? And so would a argument for the national interest, or indeed a politics in which national interest gets taken up, not actually fortify their claims, which end up being, exclusionary, anti-democratic, and so on? You note on page 20, for example, that the recognition, you recognize that the national interest has served to allow elites to cast dissidents as dupes of malevolent foreigners or even fifth columnists. So are you not concerned that the national interest could be taken up to serve precisely these kind of anti-democratic and exclusionary sorts of politics?
Well, the dissidents and the dupes of malevolent foreigners, the fifth columnists, are our ruling elites. I mean, they are the traitor class, right? So, in as much as the national interest allows us to hold them to account and to expel political leaders and governing elites who don't think in terms of defending the national interest and who only think in terms of their loyalty to supranational political forms, their obedience to supranational legal authority, their loyalty to inherited alliances abroad, and their deference and genuflection to supranational or even kind of cosmic commitments, such as the kind of risk of environmental collapse or something, or kind of planetary disintegration as a result of climate change or something. The national interest allows us to hold them to account. So the position is reversed. I mean, and this is one of the key theses of the book. So the way in which the national interest was manipulated in the past against ordinary citizens we've been through a period in which we've had similar, if not worse, abuses against ordinary citizens, which was not justified by the national interest. If you only need to think of lockdown, kind of this tremendous, this unparalleled kind of confiscation of civil liberty justified by biosecurity. Or you think of the Patriot Act and everything that happened in the war on terror, justified by a global war on terror rather than something which was purely in the national interest of the US, but something that had to be kind of internationally collaborated and coordinated on behalf of the world at large. So, because the elites abandoned the nation, it can now be used against them. And either they can, it seems to me the argument of the national interest is either that they can align themselves and submit themselves to the discipline of the nation, or they need to be overthrown.
No, I follow you
expelled.
there. I follow you there, but what about the case of ethnic suprematism of some sort, right?
So it's coming on. So it's coming on to that. So I don't, I'm not suggesting ethno-nationalism is only restricted to the periphery. I use the example because I think it's very evident there how disintegrative it's been. And the examples that I gave of, that Iraqi Sunni ethno-nationalism or ethnicity replaces, that leads to the hollowing out and disintegration of Iraq. Or in the case of the rise of Kosovo Albanian nationalism, that's part of the story of the disintegration of Yugoslavia, as well as Serbian nationalism, of course. So that's not to say like I say, it's not because there is no ethno-nationalism elsewhere and that there isn't any in the West, but that you can see its impact in terms of and how terrible it is that you have the rise of more particularistic identities that are subnational, in effect, and that lead to the disintegration of larger political structures with such devastating consequences. So, but that seems to me that the ethno-nationalism is something particularly because it understands the nation not as representative, the national interest not as something which needs articulation and representation and institutionalization, but understands it in terms of some ancient rights or lineage or some claims that is deposited by history, rather than something that needs to be solidified through the process of politics itself, something that can be taken for granted rather than something that has to be worked for and established. That is why the national interest offers the basis for the critique of these more narrow particularistic identities. And I would also go further. I'd say that is the prolongation of the era of globalization. The era in which we saw globalization was the era also of the disintegration of these larger national states, and to retreat to ethno-nationalism, which is what the far right is proposing in Western Europe, is a project of continuity globalism. It's a project of small enclaves, of smaller kind of defensive patchwork vision of politics, which is much more easily exploited, I think, by larger supranational, precisely because because the vision is smaller and crabbed and defensive. It's more easily exploited by both by the global economy, but also it requires kind of supranational security structures and political structures to coordinate them and to oversee them. So, this is here, I will happily borrow from Quinn Slobodian's argument about how globalization is based on the gouging out of the nation state. And so ethno-nationalism seems to me to be in prolongation, a continuity of that project. It's a smaller scale, it's a kind of enclave-based idea of what sovereignty is, continuing to gouge out the nation state with this kind of ethnic vision of sovereignty. And that seems to be a recipe for continued globalization.
So, maybe to bring some of this right up to the present day, what do you think is the impact of Trump? Obviously, you talked about this a little bit, or touched on some of these ideas a little bit earlier. But do you think that Trump's seeming assertion of the national interest of America's national interest means that this, the national interest is an idea whose time has come. It's going to be on the lips of every politician shortly. It's the only game in town, and then maybe that makes the story the book tells a little bit outdated, almost like it's a history of the moment just past, that passing of the national interest. I guess just kind of, yeah, because it seems like the if you'd written this book like last year, if it'd come out last year, things would be quite different to how they stand in 2025.
Possibly. I think the thesis of the book has been largely vindicated. So Trump obviously moved with greater speed in the first 6 months or so of his second administration than I anticipated, and many others anticipated. But it seems to me that it offers that all of this opens up the ground. If Trump's opponents are willing to claim the ground of the national interest, then they have a very solid terrain from which to oppose him, precisely because he claims, that is the ground of his legitimacy, that is America first. If they can show that it is not in American interests to do what he's doing, and that in fact he is substituting himself for the nation, as I indicated earlier, through this kind of highly personalized regime in which it's all based on his individual authority rather than on reinforcing the authority of the American state and America's representative institutions, it seems to me that the era of national interest is only beginning. And it's wide open political territory. And if, the Democrats are unlikely to take it, it seems to me, or they'll kind of fumble and stumble their way into it over a period of time. But whoever is willing to take that territory in any context, seems to me they can dominate the next phase of politics successfully. So I think it's the beginning of the era of national interest, in as much as Trump's trade war has forced every state to reconsider its position, not only to reconsider where it stands in the hierarchy of international trade, but also how it responds domestically. If you have to reconsider your domestic economic arrangements, consider more self-sufficiency, if you can't rely on the global trading system so much, if you have to change change the rate at which you tax your citizens, if you have to spend more or less on defense, if you have to carve out new trading relationships with new states, all of that requires not only thinking about your position in the world, but also about your internal domestic arrangements. So Trump's trade war has thrust these questions of national interest onto all other states. Now, how far they rise to that challenge is an open question, but the grounds on which they should be held to account for whatever they decide to do should be the national interest. That is the grounds on which citizens should put pressure on their states.
Yeah. No, I wonder if some of this is particularly appealing to British listeners, because it is so obvious that these are the terms of our politics now. We've left the EU. It's so much more direct that this is the possibility of holding our, I guess, our elected representatives to account directly in terms of the national interest. There isn't any, or there's one fewer barrier with the EU not being there. So if listeners, British or otherwise inclined, have been persuaded by some of the things that we've been talking about, what sort of political project comes out of this focus on the national interest? Is it kind of neutral? Is it just a good container that should be used to focus in and clarify things, or does it kind of, is it part of a wider political project in some way or other? What do you think?
So the wider political project would be restoration of the democratic nation state as the core political unit of politics, of international, of world history. In as much as, and I think the nation, by its nature, the concept of the nation is politically egalitarian, because it's predicated on the idea of legal equality between all citizens of the nation. So it points to their political participation through their legal equality. And to that extent, it's politically inclusive and democratic and politically egalitarian. And so that is the project of the national interest and the project of the nation. So it's a democratic, inclusive project of nation building. In the aftermath of globalization, the point of the national interest should be nation building, and nation building in turn consolidates and reinforces the national interest. So it's a generous and expansive and open-ended project, I think, which would aim to consolidate democracy and to consolidate the place and position of citizens within any given state.
So
I buy all of that. Sorry, I wanted to pass over to Alex, but just one thing that's struck me just as you were finishing that answer is whether it's necessarily a democratic project, because I guess it seems that if you're talking about representation, that would necessarily lead towards a kind of a democratic mechanism. But just to go back to talking previously, or China was mentioned previously, it seems like that this is a good. Actually, maybe I'm talking myself into agreeing with you. It seems like maybe China acts objectively in the national interest, but not subjectively. I.e., there may be some way in which the the Chinese state acts in a way that promotes the interests of Chinese citizens, but there is no mechanism of constructing the national interest. There is no political process. This is kind of is made. So I guess maybe maybe I've just answered my own question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
But
that
does it have to be democratic? Because presumably, like a nation, there are non-democratic nations. A non-democratic nation could it put forward its national interest in a non-democratic way, which would then kind of short circuit all of the things that you've been saying, and maybe it's not so good in that situation.
no, sure. So, but the national interest is no guarantee of democracy, but it points towards democracy, in the sense that by its nature, as I suggest, that it seems to me it's logically given in the concept of the nation that it pushes towards political egalitarianism, and as a result of political egalitarianism, it
Yeah.
pushes towards political cohesion, and that requires social and economic cohesion as a result, and so by its nature, it pushes towards democracy. So it's no guarantee of democracy, but it is certainly the basis of a pro-democratic critique in any state, any authoritarian autocratic state that claims to act on behalf of the national interest. That would be an obvious weak point for Democrats seeking to hold that state to account. You are not actually acting in the national interest. You're not actually acting on behalf of the nation. And that'd certainly be the strongest claim of the Chinese Communist Party, right? That they act on behalf of the Chinese nation. It's a
Yeah.
strong representative claim. So anyone who is willing to challenge the Chinese Communist Party would have to take them on that terrain, that you are not good or effective exponents and defenders of the Chinese nation. You're not effective defenders of the Chinese national interest. Anyone who didn't do that wouldn't win against the Chinese Communist Party.
But it's not a representational claim. It's a kind of equivalence claim, right? So we know better than you do what what our national interest is. We don't need to ask you. We can calculate this. Anyhow, yeah.
I mean,
I think you're right.
it's representative without the so they can if they it's the logic is pushes towards representation. So if you're claiming to act on somebody else's behalf without that other party being able to exercise control over you, or to exercise discipline over you, or to have some kind of oversight over you, then that demands those extra levels, and so it offers the basis for greater accountability.
So one thought that was prompted by this is just that the nation, I mean, as much as your book actually, proposes itself as something forward-looking, as a project of modernization, of nation building, and so on, looking forward, its reference points in the past are kind of 1789 and 1848. But reading the book, it actually made me think how little nation, at least under the terms that you describe, there has actually been. Because even if it doesn't need to be democratic, it needs to at least rhetorically be integrative of the masses. And I was just thinking of like some cases. I mean, I ended up thinking about Brazil in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, early 60s, the so-called populist period, where a lot of that was dictatorial, not democratic, although some of it was democratic. But there was a proposition that Brazilian politics represented the nation and that it was integrative of the working class. But it's important that a whole backdrop of rural poverty, of rural workers, were excluded from that. For example, they weren't included in the labor code that was instituted through the kind of slightly Mussolini-inspired corporatist government of the time. So it's amazing how even something like that, where you'd say, well, I guess that still fits the nation, it didn't attend to the terms that you stipulate in terms of speaking for the nation as a whole. So this seems like an old idea, that you're referring to, an idea of the early 19th century, but in many ways it's something which has maybe never truly been realized in large parts of the globe. Anyway, but that's maybe just a comment. I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
No, I don't disagree, but I think the most effective critique is the one that is internal to the proposition, right? So in the case of if a governing authority claims to act on behalf of the nation and there are swathes, masses of people, citizens, members of that political community that are in some way excluded or discounted, then there is a very obvious means to demand their entry and demand that their interests be accounted for within that political collectivity. And that the national interest offers that. Again, obviously it doesn't guarantee it. And we can, the Brazilian example is a good one of the failure, but that's a failure of the Brazilian nation. And there we can identify where the failure is, and the fact that it is ultimately the failure of the Brazilian state, the Brazilian political elite, to hold themselves to their very own standards.
So we have a question from a listener who sent this in advance. Ashley Atkinson says, in another podcast, I can't believe Phil has been on another podcast. This is it. Should immediately be excluded from this one. In another podcast.
It's not canon. It's not canon. We don't need to actually listen to it. The only things that Phil says on this podcast are canon.
Right. True. In another podcast on his book, Phil mentioned that he would be happy to support a federal Europe depending on the arrangements and how it was achieved. There wasn't much expansion on that in that podcast, so I've been left wondering what this federal Europe would entail and how this aligns with the national interest of European nations.
Yeah, so it's not exactly what I said, or at least not what I meant. So what I said in the podcast was that I always had grudging on the other side. My grudging admiration was always reserved for the European federalists among all of the supporters of European unification and integration. And that's because there was a coherent political vision there. So it wasn't just some technocratic hand-waving about collaboration and peace and growth and trade and the supremacy of European law or whatever. There was actually a vision of political integration into a single new political entity. And so, I'm not, the national interest isn't a claim to freeze any particular, it's not a commitment to keep the map as it currently is locked in place in perpetuity, or to say that every nation state that exists today deserves to exist forever simply by virtue of existing today. There is scope, it seems to me, within a defense of the national interest to envision larger, more integrated polities, but they would have to be themselves new nations. They would have to be defended and articulated in terms of a new national interest. So if there was the prospect of a united Europe that would constitute a new nation, a union, a nation, the single integrated political community of all of Europe's citizens with a single center of sovereignty and public power, then that would be a proposition worth considering. And the point is, though, that the European elite have had plenty of opportunities, at least since the financial crisis of 2008, to make a pitch in that regard, to offer us a vision of what a federal Europe, a united Europe might look like. And they've consistently failed to do so. So that's not accidental. I think that reflects the fact that the European Union is precisely designed to avoid the concentration of public power. It's designed to gouge nation states. It's designed to disperse and decentralize public power because it's designed to avoid accountability. Yeah. So, we will never. So I have grudging admiration for the Federalists, but I do not think a united Europe is in any kind of meaningful way a likely outcome of European integration. So European integration was designed. This is the story that I tell in the book, and I've told elsewhere, and said it with George as well in stuff that we did around Brexit, and in the book that we wrote together, Taking Control, with our two co-authors. We make the case the point of European integration was to avoid the accountability embedded in the sovereign nation state. And so if they reunited Europe, they would only reproduce precisely the problem that the European Union was designed to avoid in the first place. And that's why it's never going to happen. So a federal Europe isn't on the cards. And for that reason, this is why I don't think it's worth considering or offering up an idea of what a national interest at the European level might look like.
So, for listeners, you might have been listening to this. You might have heard Phil talking about synthesizing interests at a higher level, but only on a national basis. No talk really of class. Throughout the book, there's classes mentioned, but class struggle is not advocated. The class interest is not advocated. It's the national interest. And so this might lead you to thinking, especially if you're a long time followers of Phil's and listener to this podcast. Okay, so what's going on here? So I think, and maybe you can want to challenge the premise of this question, but as far as I see it, there's an abandonment of class politics and of Marxism here, which is explicit, and I think that's fine. That I'm not charging you with that or saying that that's an error. I'm saying,
However, be careful with your answer, because others may we reserve the right to charge you later if your answers are not up to snuff.
Accusing you. Yeah, anyway, so to what extent does the abandonment of class politics that this book represents apply retrospectively to your understanding of modern history? So is your claim that all that stuff about class and internationalism and Marxism was good back then, but it's gone, so now we have to start afresh? That if we're going to do politics today, it has to be on a national basis, not a class basis? Or is it actually revisionist in the sense of revising your own previously held commitments and saying, actually, it was a mistake to not prioritize the national interest, that proletarian internationalism was a mistake?
No. So look, ever since we set up Bunga, before we set up Bunga, I think we understood all very well. I'm speaking in the royal we for the podcast as a whole, that the prospect of some kind of working class revolution or the realization of a Marxian vision of socialism, something like that, was not an imminent or foreseeable likelihood, and hadn't been for a very long time. And so we were very much trying to think through the ruins of, or the consequences and implications of that, in the context of some kind of revival of left politics, of left populist politics, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So that was what we were chewing with, but I don't think we ever had none of us thought that there was the likelihood or possibility of a working class revolution. Even in the moment that we might have, even in those moments that we might have been or appeared most sympathetic to Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or whoever it might have been. So with that in mind, there is no it's not that there is some kind of abandonment of working class politics. So quite the opposite, it seems to me, because with the nation is precisely that possibility for working class politics today. It's the most obvious means through which the working class can defend their interests as a class. So it's precisely the fact that the classical idea of the problem of the nation was that it dilutes dilutes working class interests by allowing them to be mingled with the interests of ruling elites. But as I already indicated, given the fact that our rulers and governing elites have retreated and abandoned the idea of the nation, it is available to the majority, the immense majority, to seize it and wield it, and to use it as the political expression of their interests.
Okay, but then you would have a melding, perhaps not of working class interest with elite interest, but working class interest with petty bourgeois interest, with the interests of professionals,
Sure.
etc. Yeah,
sure. So I mean, I'm not making the case. It's not a. I'm not making the case for a. I'm not making the case for socialism, in the sense, certainly not in the sense of a Marxist case of the dictatorship of the proletariat supplanting private ownership of the means of production or anything like that. But like I say, we've never claimed that was something which was likely or possible. So this vista of the nation is only opened up in the aftermath of the disintegration of capitalist globalization, and only in the aftermath of the fact that, particularly in the case of Britain, that you've had the working class directly tangling with questions of state power, without the intermediary of the Labour Party, or quite in the opposite, in fact, with the direct opposition, hostile opposition of the Labour Party, and without the intermediary of the trade unions and the trade union bureaucracy. I mean, this has been Pete Ramsey's point with respect to Brexit. And you see similar kind of, not quite as ambitious or direct working class kind of tangling with questions of basic constitutional questions in other instances. But with the rise of populism and the shift away of the traditional social democratic parties away from the working class and organized labor to the middle classes, that in that context, this is the form of working class politics. So it is the form of mass democratic politics for popular self-government, which is very much in the interests of the working class. So it's not an abandonment of class politics.
No,
It
but
isn't
it's class as nationally bound, socially integrated with the state, etc.
absolutely. But again, I mean, like I say, we were never. It is certainly, it isn't anything like a classical Marxian vision of socialism or the emancipation of the working class as Marx understood it. But like I say, we never set up the pod, and we never approached politics from the viewpoint that that was a likelihood or a possibility. And so the full measure of that conclusion has to be taken into account, because the Marxian case is not predicated simply on the fact of class antagonisms. Now, there's the famous letter to Wedermeyer where Marx says, look, I never said I discovered the class struggle. He said that what he established was the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that claim was predicated on the idea of a political consciousness of distinct class interests, not just the kind of tectonic plates of opposed economic interests grinding away at each other, but also a political consciousness of opposed interests between classes in the context of nations. Right. So if you don't have that political consciousness, then there is no real meaning, and certainly no practical political meaning to Marxism. So this is a class
Okay.
politics. It's not a class politics in the sense of that the working class supplanting private property, but it is a working class politics in the sense, or what would be called in classical Marxist terms, a radical bourgeois politics, which will advance the interests of the working class, and which is eminently
No,
desirable
I
and
think that's
necessary.
I think that's fine. I might seek to hold you to account for some past statements or past lines of criticism that you've mounted, but this is not a show
Please
trial, so I will
do.
not be doing this. No.
It's not a
That's for another
trial.
time. That's
It's not a
take
trial
take
show.
the take the
It's a show trial.
opportunity.
it's a trial show. It's not a show trial. Yeah, that's good line.
Take the
George.
opportunity.
No, so what we're gonna I have another question, and it's gonna be my final one, more or less, which follows on very directly from that. So much of what is presented here, and I'm sure listeners will have cottoned on to this, hearing you speak, and certainly when they come to read your book, which they absolutely should do, might come to similar conclusions, which is that to see, following the lines of the book, to see the political and economic regime of mid-century nation states favorably. I mean, those in the capitalist core at any rate, right? That to a certain extent, they embody a certain sense of the nation, of representation, certainly the highest point that democratic representation has reached, but also in terms of states that pursued the national interest, more or less, right? Does this mean that your Marxist criticisms and antagonism and hostility, really, to anything reeking of the New Deal and indeed of social democracy, old school social democracy, was in fact misguided? Because you often were critical of anything, for example, even mentions of the Green New Deal, because precisely it sounded a little bit too much like New Deal. And that's a bad thing, because, Roosevelt was a American aristocrat trying to save American capitalism rather than
Yeah.
being a revolutionary, and so on, right?
Yeah.
So, you even mentioned with regard to Roosevelt that his comments about enlightened selfishness and serving the national interest would sound positively Trumpian if uttered by an American politician today, end quote. Indeed, Chris Croutrone makes this point that Trump is actually just an old-style Democrat. And, certainly that has an element of truth to it. But actually, you place yourself in alignment with both, not with Croutrone, but with Roosevelt and with Trump. That old-style social democracy, kind of okay now, right?
And
No.
why were you so rude about the New Deal? Like, why was your tone so intemperate? I will tack that on, because I think it's important. You said mean things in a mean way, and now you agree with them.
Well,
No,
that's
no, I
basically it.
don't.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. George's jibe aside, I think it's a good George's jibe. There you go. Not just George's gist, but George's jibe. it's a good question. No, I don't think so. I don't think I'm going back on it, because the case for the national interest is not a restorationist one. I mean, I think, there's plenty to say that was positive about the mid 20th century welfare states and their greater claims to representation. But it is a positive one. It is not a nostalgic one. It's not about restoring or recreating. And I don't think we should be bound by, I mean, the whole thrust, if there is a definite continuity in my work, it's that we shouldn't be haunted by the 20th century and imagine that the greatest we can aspire to is simply to kind of recreate the legacy of the past.
No,
So,
sure, but so I imagine that you would respond this, and I think that's fine. Of course, you're not
well,
talking
I've
about
not
going back
finished.
to
I've not
to
finished.
1940. No, but let me just to be clear about the point that I'm making is
Yeah,
why the hostility to
yeah,
that.
yeah.
If it's something which you're like, well, but it was all right, like, okay, sure, you don't want to go,
No,
can't go
it
back to it, blah blah
was
blah.
no insufficient. So, I mean, I wouldn't, but there's plenty of criticisms of the New Deal, which I think you could make from the vantage point of the national interest, not least the rise of the administrative state and the displacement of popular self government by this vastly expanded new machinery of the American state. So there's plenty of advantage points from which the New Deal can be attacked, and within this vision of the national interest. So it's not, the national interest is not to elevate the mid 20th century state. And it seems to me also, by the same token, the criticism of those states was that they fell short of what the nation expected and what the nation demanded. And to that extent, there is a red thread within, going back to the classical Marxist claim, which, famously in the Communist Manifesto is the working class must constitute itself the nation, by which he meant, not that where the working class, that there's a working class identity separate to that of national identity, but the nation understood as those entitled to participate in political decision making. And so, if the working class constitutes itself the nation, then it is the working class directly governing itself as the political community. That the immense majority undertake the task of self-government in their own for themselves and in their own interest. By the people for the people. It's consistent with that kind of that classical understanding of self-determination. So it's
Why
very
were you
much
so mean about Garibaldi too? Because Garibaldi here emerges as a hero tacitly
when
in
was
your
I mean
telling.
about Garibaldi? I was
Yeah,
always sympathetic.
you've been hostile to
No,
Garibaldi
no. There
on this
is. I mean,
podcast.
I think there's limits to that kind of romantic Garibaldian nationalism, and particularly worse, I think, in its 20th century later incarnations. But no, I was. I've always been. I think I've always been let a listener, let a
I think
eagle-eyed
I think
listener.
even someone close to this podcast, a regular contributor, even made some comment about this. That it was like, oh, Phil being mean about Garibaldi. One final point, which I addressed to the
Okay.
author of Lenin Lives, which is, if class politics, but nationally bound, integrated with the state, and so on, was socialism in one country actually correct? Was Stalin right? In fact, but Stalin's error was not going far enough in breaking with Lenin and world revolution. That do you
Well,
recant
no,
and actually
I do
look
not
more
recant.
kindly
So,
upon
yeah,
upon
so
upon the Soviet Union
instead of
under
socialism
Stalin?
in one country, socialism in each country.
Well,
So,
Well,
exactly, but
no,
that's the same thing.
because you can't have socialism in one country. But I'm not making the case for socialism. I'm not making the case for the working class expropriating private ownership of the means of production. So, socialism in one country is impossible, as indeed was proved by the experience of the Soviet Union. So, it is not a defense of socialism in one country. And it
Social
wouldn't be a
democracy in one
backhanded
country.
it wouldn't be a backhanded vindication of it either. Well, no, nor that either. I mean, social democracy was also, I mean, at least up until the mid 20th century and even past that point, radical social democracy understood itself to be a revolutionary doctrine, right? So, in so much as they, fell short of their own claims about what they were trying to do, you could criticize them. But I'm not making the claim for social democracy. I mean, something I would be open and supportive and enthusiastic, about a new vision of social democracy for the 21st century, and that might borrow freely and draw inspiration from, the social democracy of the 20th century. But it would seem to me it would need to obviously go past the failures of that earlier model as well, not simply to try and replicate it.
Okay, very good. I've got a lot more, but we're going to have to end this here. I'm sure this is a conversation or a type of conversation which we'll be able to carry through in future episodes on maybe other topics, and look at how this idea of the national interest might apply in specific cases, which actually might shed even more light on these ideas. But listener, go out and buy Phil's book, The National Interest. If you're in the UK, it's already out. In the US, it'll be out in September, from Polity. And thank you for being a guest, Phil.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be a guest on BungaCast, the podcast that I helped set up. So yes, it's good. It's good to chat, and it's also good to talk about, because I've not had the opportunity really to talk about the intellectual continuity and difference in terms of this book compared to earlier work that I've done. So that is also useful to be held to account to that. So because I've not had that opportunity yet in discussing this book.
No doubt our listeners will have many penetrating questions and follow-ups on this too. We look forward to receiving them and discussing them in due course. But that's it from us for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.